Okay, welcome to technical session number 43, where today we're going to be talking about Windows security settings. So briefly, we talked about the router aspects, like securing the Soho wireless and wired routers. We gave brief overviews of security, some initial steps we can take for prevention methods, also stepping into physical prevention using things like man traps and perimeter fencing, guards, cameras, biometrics, things like that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Windows, and we're going to be defining some different types of user access that people will have. We'll be talking about NTFS a little bit more and how it intends to address some of the security threats that you have. Compare and contrast the various NTFS directory and file permissions, and describe a little bit single sign-on, Bitlocker, and EFS as well. All right, throughout this particular technical session, we're going to be trying to keep in mind adaptability. As always with security, the threats are constantly changing, evolving, and this happens on pretty much a daily basis. So we have to be able to change and maneuver in order to meet these challenges. So adaptability is a huge aspect within this. Also, personal responsibility, taking responsibility for our actions, both the good and the bad, and understanding that things we do now affect what happens in the future. So first, we're going to talk about a couple various types of user accounts and groups within the Windows environment. Essentially, a group is a container that will hold user accounts. So you can say all of us are one particular group, and we would have varying levels of users within this group. Or that group could be operations, or that group could be accounting, or that group could be HR. And even within these groups, you may have varying levels of access. In total, this is an efficient way to kind of manage multiple users, especially if you're talking large corporations where you may have hundreds of people in a given group. And you want to be able to efficiently manage that on the networks. All right. You can also utilize groups within standalone computers as well. And to be fair, a single account can be members of multiple groups. So there are four main types of of member groups that you utilize in Windows. You have the administrators group, which would have basically the most access. You would have your users group, which would be the average person on your network. That would be kind of like you or me as we are now. Obviously, our goal is to become IT administrators. But if we worked in operations, we would be considered a standard user. You have guests group, which hopefully we're disabling those. And then you have a power user group, which is somewhere between a standard user and an administrator with regards to access. All right. Let's see here. Betsy, can you please read for us about the administrator group?
Administrator group privilege has the power to do from the smallest task all the way up to removing the operating system, most powerful of all users, who to give access to. Any member of the administrators group has complete administrator privilege to protect against doing mistakes. The practice of logging in with an administrator's account for daily interaction is strongly discouraged.
Excellent, thank you. So we briefly touched on this last week where we talked about even if you have an administrative level account, you want to only use that absolutely and utterly necessary. You're going to use a standard user account for 99% of the work that you do. This will decrease what is called your surface area for attack significantly, because you don't want, if an account gets breached, you don't want it to be your administrator account, because then they would have full access over the system. So if there is going to be a breach, you would rather it be on a user account where they wouldn't have administrative privileges. So, and they basically can do almost anything in the system. They have the highest level of authority or privilege within the system. Next, power users. Bernard, can you read first, please?
Power user group privileges gives user read-write permission to the system, allows them to install most software, but keeps them from changing key operating system files. Who gives access to? Who to give access to? Those who need to test software, such as programmers and junior administrators.
There you go. So for the most part, coders and junior admin to perform, again, the majority of the tasks that they may need to on an administrative level, but not giving them those key component changes like operating system files. But they can add and remove software. They can do updates, troubleshooting, all kinds of stuff. Next, standard user. Rahel, can you please read for us?
Standard users privileges can read-write permission to their own profile, but cannot modify system-wide registry settings or access critical system files. Who to give access to? Regular users that belong to default users group.
Okay, thank you. So this is like your average employee. The vast majority of people on your network will be what is considered a standard user. They can utilize the software. They can perform whatever tasks we allow them access to, but they can't do any major changes. You know, typically we would not allow them to install software to our system unless it is from a predetermined set of applications that we allow. And beyond that, we will not allow them to make any changes. Guest group. Cedric, can you read for us, please?
Privilege. Same rights as the users, except they can't get to log files. Who to give access to? This account is created by default and he is a member of this group. The best reason to make a user member of the guest group is if they are accessing the system only for a limited time.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. So the way they're stating it is, you know, you would, if you're allowing somebody access for a limited time, like maybe an intern or something like that, or, you know, somebody who's only going to be there for a short period of time, like, you know, a salesperson who's come in real life, likely you would make a standard user account with very, very limited access to things and have them utilize that, because then you can target what they have access to, what they do not have access to, because likely they may need more than just signing in to go check their email or something. All right. So configuring users and groups. So every version so far has a tool that you can use to manage your groups. This is typically in the control panel, and it's called user accounts is one of them, or more advanced versions like your enterprise or education level ones might have one called local users and groups as well. From here, you can add people, set their permissions, establish what they do and do not have access to. disabling accounts, guest accounts, what have you. Obviously, you would need administrative level authority to be able to make changes to this area. Questions so far? And we already talked about groups before when we talked about home groups versus work groups versus domains. So this is kind of a bit of a review. Yes, Golly.
Yeah, what is the difference? Well, kind of know the difference, but like, what is the main difference between that and like an Active Directory? Like,
well, Active Directory would be something like this, but you would use it on a domain.
Oh, okay.
A little more involved. So that would be a domain level way to manage groups. So versus this is an individual system.
Okay, so it's just like much larger, like if you're using more like computers, like you said, more domain, like just a larger, like more computers and stuff?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right. UAC, we talked about this one a little bit earlier when we were first getting into Windows and stuff like that, but this gets into a little bit more detail than we were used to prior. Joyce, can you read for us, please, about user access or user account control, excuse me.
Yes. User account control. The user account control UAC is intended to prevent unintentional or unauthorized changes to the computer by either prompting for permission to continue or requiring the administrator password before continuing. UAC was introduced in Vista and works for both standard user and administrator accounts. To make UAC less aggressive, Microsoft introduced 4 UAC levels in Windows 7. Always notify me only when programs try to make changes to my PC. Notify me only when programs try to make changes to my computer. Do not dim my desktop. Never notify.
So much like firewall settings, when people come across this for the first time, they're like, yeah, I want the highest security possible. And then they turn it all the way on to always notify. And then after about 30 minutes and receiving, 100 notifications in the first 30 minutes when everything is dinging you, then they'll come back in here and turn it off to never notify. This is generally the standard operation with regards to the USC on an individual basis. Who's done something like this? Like with their firewall, when they first got a computer, like, I want the best security I can have, and turn it to maximum. And then you realize you have very, very little ability to do the things you want to do. And then you come back in, you're like, yeah, I didn't want security anyway. So.
Yep.
I am definitely guilty of this. I did this many times. I think I did this with almost every PC I ever bought up until getting into generation. Where it was just like, when I was first setting it up, I was like, I want the best security ever. And I maximized it and then was like, oh, this is so annoying. And then just pulled back to almost nothing.
Or it turns into white noise too. Sometimes you leave them on and it's like, oh, okay, never mind.
Ignore. And it's sitting there going like, critical threat. Don't care, ignore. I want to play Valorant. So. All right, parental controls. So on the user accounts that you've created within your groups, you can set up ones for your kids. And you can set all kinds of fun little factors, like you can monitor their activities, you can limit their activities, what they can and cannot see. I believe you can even set up the amount of time they can be on in a given day. And, over a week's period, things like that. So, if you're wanting to kind of put the screen time limitations on autopilot, this is one place you can go to do that if you so choose. And you can also basically tell it, these are the websites I do not allow. This is the type of content I will not allow. And it works as being able to block the content from kids. But they have versions of this kind of for employees as well. We don't want people going to gambling sites. We don't want them going to various other types of sites on the company network, so we can restrict that as we need to. All right. On to the NTFS. We remember talking about this, and we were talking about different file structures and the file allocation tables and all that fun stuff. This gets us into a little bit more detail with regards to that. This came in with Windows NT. And it was a way to kind of handle the growing sizes of file systems and disks that we currently had. It added some nice, fun security features to make things a little more user-friendly and obviously improve upon security measures for our drives and file systems. And it also brought a little bit more stability to the party. So with the NTFS, your files, your directories, volumes can each have their own individual security for each segments. The nice thing about it is it's pretty flexible, so you can set, I want this stuff to be able to be viewed and they can only read it. I want this stuff to be able to be viewed and modified in this file folder. I want this stuff to not be viewed or not be read by anybody other than me. So we can set our file permissions and create a much greater level of flexibility for ourselves as well as other members of our group, because we could also have permissions for our group level and then everybody else. So everybody in the group can see and modify, everybody else can only see it. So some of the aspects of security for NTFS we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking a little bit about permissions, file permissions versus directory permissions, single sign-on, a little bit more into Bitlocker, and then EFS. Does anybody remember what EFS stood for?
Encryption file system?
Yes. All right. NTFS permissions. Let's see here. Stephen, can you please read for us?
Yeah, NTFS permissions, shared permissions apply only when a user is accessing a file or folder through the network. Local permissions and attributes are used to protect the file when the user is local. NTFS permissions are able to protect at the file level, while shared permissions can be applied to the direct level only. And NTFS permissions can affect users logged on locally or across the network to the system where the NTFS permissions are applied. Shared permissions are in effect only when the user connects to the resource via the network.
Excellent, thank you. So you set different level, you can set different levels for locally versus sharing. So locally on the same system, sharing over the network. Basically breaks it down. Give us a little bit greater flexibility with regards to that. All right. So we have, and I know we touched on this a little bit because we're all caught up on our test out labs, right? Yeah. I hope so. So thanks for the honesty, Stephen. I appreciate it. We can either allow, not allow, or deny. And then if we want to set permissions at the folder level, you have, which is inherited, which means if it's set for inherited, it goes down through the subfolders unless otherwise changed. So once you've set it at the file level, it goes all the way through everything within that folder system. That's considered inherited. All right. We'll get into inherited versus not inherited permissions, cumulative. And then you have what's it, cumulative. If you have a user member that has read permission and the member of the group has write permission, they effectively have both read and write, meaning because they're granting these permissions from two separate places, they kind of build on top of each other. So we have to take that into account a little bit. But there's a nice little graphic that kind of shows the different permissions as far as file and domain and what it means, and kind of clears things up just a little bit. Now, pay very close attention to this. Copying versus moving a file with regards to the permissions that that file has. So when you copy a file, then that file will take on the permissions of the folder you have created it in. So if I've copied a file from my shared drive to my home folder, it's going to apply the permissions from my home folder, the inherited permissions from my home folder, to that new copied file. If I move a file, it will keep the same permissions from its original location. So if I move a file from the shared drive down to my drive, rather than copy it, if it says, you know, DW, Rachel, and I all have access, then they will still have access to it even though I've moved it. If I copy the file, but I copy it to my personal drive where only I have access, even though DW and Rachel had access originally, they would not now, because of the new file system I put it in does not allow them access. Does that make sense? So please keep that in mind, permissions in copying versus moved. You will likely receive a couple questions on this. So copying, it takes on the new file's permissions. Moving maintains the file permissions from where it came. All right.
So with that said, like if somebody was like a file was under, like, let's say the share, like, or like their private folder, and they're basically saying, you know, you don't have access or somebody doesn't have access. So all you have to do to remove those access is just copy that full file to like whatever you want it to be. And then once you copy it over, all those people that didn't have access would have access now?
They would not have access.
They would not have access?
If I copied it and I moved it to a file where nobody had access but me, they would not have access. Or did I misunderstand your question?
Yeah, you're saying the opposite of that.
Yeah, like, no, I'm saying, okay, if like you didn't have access, and then like, but instead of moving it, you copy that file to your personal folder, would you have access now?
Well, likely if I did not have access before, I wouldn't be able to copy it.
Yes, that's exactly the.
Oh, okay.
So somebody
So
who
if somebody
had
copied it
access
for
would
you.
need to copy it for me into a folder system where I would have access.
Oh, okay, got it.
So take a screenshot of this. Please, please commit this to memory. Copying versus moving a file. This is very important. All right. So here are the different file permissions with regards to NTFS that you can implement at the file level. So you have full control. Basically, they can do whatever they want to it. They can execute from it. They can read it. They can write to it, modify it, and they can change ownership if they so choose. So if you give them full control and then they feel you shouldn't have access to it, they could actually remove you from it. So they have full control and access to be able to change permissions as they see fit. So that would be full control. Read allows them to essentially view the contents of the file and see the ownership attributes. That's about it. So if they can see it, if you want to be able to modify it, say DW owns a file, I'm able to read it, but I want to make some changes to it, I would have to send a message to DW and say, hey, can you, possibly give me greater permission on this so that I can modify this document. You have read and execute. The person has the ability to read a file and then the ability to execute from it. This helps with regards to if you're writing scripts or something like that, then people can actually use it and test it and stuff like that as well. Then you have write, which allows the user to overwrite a file, to make changes, but they're still only able to see ownership and permissions. They're not able to make any changes, but they can see who owns it and who has and what permissions are allotted. And then you have modify, which combines both read and execute and write together in a single type of permission. Yes, Kali.
Wait, so for the write, you say that like you still can't, like I don't understand the write. Like you saying like they can't change anything. So
Well, they wouldn't be able to execute from it. So if you're creating scripts or different protocols or something like that, you're writing something that they would try to run, then they would not be able to run that program, from the file. Reading it, they can see it. That's about it. And then you have write, where they can actually make changes to it. So you might say they can either read or write, but they cannot execute from it. So they cannot execute whatever program they're writing to. Or if it's just a document, they wouldn't be able to change the bibliography or change the footnotes or update the pages or anything like that.
Yeah, that was like my thing, because I was thinking of it like in a document term, not like a script.
Well, this is in a file term.
Okay.
So maybe you have like small little applets within the file. Like we had road service applications or something like that, and say we put it in a file and somebody could see that those applications are there, but they can't run those applications.
Okay.
So they wouldn't be able to execute them or get them to run. But you can see that they're there. And maybe they would have write permissions where they could update documents and things like that.
It's good to imagine like a folder a mixed folder where you have a couple documents in there, and probably like Microsoft Office installation, exe or MSI, and you can't run those, you can't execute those particular files, but you can actually open a document and read it. Yeah. So that's the only, so it's all in that mixed folder. You can only read the stuff that you can read, but not execute anything that has a MSI, exe, etc.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, I got it a little bit. I don't know. I'm still a little confused. I will have to see like a physical. I'll look online, watch a video.
Oh no, there's one in the test out. I'll show you later, man.
Yeah, like I don't think. Did we get to those? Or that's why I'm like, did I miss that one?
It's in the 6s, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I think those are the 6s, somewhere in the 6s.
Like I did the permission, like I understood, like I did the lab with like just giving the permission, but I don't really understand like how they really function. Like I can do it, like I can give permission and take that away, whatever. I did that lab, but I just don't understand the concept itself. So that's what I'm gonna look into. But thank you though. Appreciate it.
We can talk about it, man. No problem.
All right. Next, here's basically a graphic where it shows your file permissions here. And you can set it up for groups or individual users at the file level. So you would right click on your file, go into your properties, advanced settings, permissions, and then you'd be able to set this up. And bear with me, my mouse battery died. Working on that while I'm talking to you. All right, Next, we have directory permissions. So this would be for the whole directory. Similar, maybe with some slight differences. We have full control, where the user has permission to basically do whatever they need to or want to. They can take ownership of it if they wish, or any of its content, and change the permission levels as they see fit at the directory level. Again, read allows them to navigate the entire directory structure, view the contents. They can look in any files in the directory and then see the ownership attributes with regards to it, but they can't really make any changes. Read and execute, which I said it combines the permission with those of the list folder contents and has the ability to run executables. So like if you have a directory, within that directory, you have a couple a couple documents, and then maybe you had Candy Crush in there for some reason. You didn't want anybody messing with your high score, so you put it to where they can only read it, they can't execute it. But people with read and execute would be able to turn on Candy Crush and actually go in there and play a little bit. And then you have write. They could create new entities within the folder themselves, like create new documents, as well as change some attributes with regards to those documents. Then you have list folder, which allows the user to view the contents of the directory and to navigate its subdirectories. That's about it. Then you have modify, combines the read and execute permissions with the write. So you have read, write, and execute with regards. And it also allows the user to delete everything in the directory as well. But again, they still can't change permissions. These two slides are good ones to kind of have screenshots of. This one here. Hopefully everybody got it, but I got that one. And then this one here.
What's the difference between read and list folder?
Well, read would actually allow you to look at the documents and read the documents themselves, where list folder would tell you basically the name of the document, but you wouldn't actually be able to go in and look at it.
Okay, got it.
So one basically would allow you to kind of navigate the directories. The other one would actually let you go all the way down in, and if there was a document you wanted to read in there, you'd be able to see it. Or read the document, excuse me. List folder would just let you know what the name of the document was. All right, and here's what that looks like. Graphical form looks very similar to the file level. All right, single sign-on. This is kind of a way to authenticate and give users access to all the applications that they need to have access to. When you join up with some companies, you may need to access 20 or 30 applications at any given time. I know in transportation, we had a ton we had to get access to. And you have to have an individual sign in and password for every single one of these applications. You can develop something called password fatigue, where you get tired of trying to memorize so many different passwords that you basically just give everything the exact same password. And I don't care if it's my email, my bank account, my sign on to my computer for work. Everything is just going to be some amalgamation of my universal password that I use. This is exceedingly dangerous because hackers tend to rely upon this. So if they can gain access to one password, they will compare that against all your other passwords that you may have access to see if they work. And unfortunately, it usually does. So in an effort to kind of get around this, we use an authentication server, something like Kerberos. And basically what it does is it kind of gives you a ticket work. I think Kerberos gives you, it's like ticket granting tickets or something like that. So you go through an authentication server. At one point, it gives you a token or a ticket or something along those lines, something that basically says you are who you say you are. And because you have that, you've gone through the authentication server, it allows you access to everything you're supposed to have access in already. You don't have to worry about memorizing all those fun passwords and all that kind of stuff. It's just done through this single sign-on. Makes life pretty easy, significantly easier for us. You're only signing in one time. It reduces that password fatigue. So it can still maintain some security complexity, saves time from having to re-enter passwords, reset passwords, all that kind of fun stuff. And it also reduces your IT costs with regards to passwords themselves. Only downfall is, I'll get you in 1 second there, Modena. Only downfall is if they get access through the single sign-in, they have access to everything. So from a security perspective, if that one level is breached, then they have access to everything you have access to. So again, convenience versus security, right? Yes, Modena, do you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the single sign-on. In the case of you using your Facebook to open other apps, is that like a single sign-on?
Yes, because you're using Facebook to authenticate you to other systems.
All right.
So basically, they're saying, hey, we trust Facebook. I don't know, but they're saying, hey, we trust Facebook. And then Facebook says, yes, this person is who they say they are. So then that grants you access to your accounts. But here's the downfall. If somebody gains access to your Facebook account, they now have access to everything else that you had through there. So, but yes, that is a perfect example of, something you can do. Google sign-on is the same way, because you can use that to authenticate you for other systems. Social sign-on, is that a system you use, Oscar? I'm not familiar with that one, is why I'm asking.
No, that's what she was referring to with the logging in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you basically, yeah, it's association through another system. Okay. I don't know if that was a particular system itself. So, all right. So that's a little bit more in SSO. Then you have Bitlocker, which we talked about earlier, which is whole drive encryption. Where it can also, it does full drive encryption, but it also will allow it to have a lock on it so that if anything has been altered within the system itself, it will not boot at that point, which obviously would have its pluses and minuses if you are forced to make a change and then this locks you out. That can create major problems. It can also lock the drive to a particular machine. What piece of hardware might we use in order to do this so that it knows my machine from, say, DW's machine? TPM, which is the what was that, Stephanie?
Trusted platform model.
You are absolutely correct. So that's that little piece of hardware that is soldered onto our motherboard that allows us to lock the drive to that particular machine. So if somebody comes in and tries to steal our hard drive and then put it in another computer and use it that way, they are not able to. It essentially locks them out. There's another version of Bitlocker to go. You can install this on USB drives or removable drives, excuse me. And this allows that same technology to kind of lock those drives and prevent unauthorized access to the files that are stored on them.
So Bitlocker is more like for like physical drives and stuff like that, not like for internal drive.
Well, this would be, Bitlocker itself would be for your internal drives. They have Bitlocker to go, which you can use for removable drives or USBs.
Okay.
All right. Next, EFS, encryption file system, is another encryption tool, but rather than doing the entire drive itself, it allows you to do this for individual files. And it's built into the business, enterprise, and ultimate levels for 7, 8, 8.1, and then professional or enterprise with regards to Windows 10. So it gives you that level of encryption, but thankfully it does it for the individual file, because encrypting and decrypting an entire drive takes a lot of processing power. Single files, a lot less. Again, you may want to encrypt your tax documents, banking statements, all that stuff. You may not want to encrypt your, your Candy Crush high scores. All right. So this kind of shows some of the user accounts where Windows 7 supports administrator standard. There is no power user on Windows 7. Remember, we talked about that as being one of them. And then you have a guest account, and thankfully Vista and Windows 7 disable this by default. All right. Add a user. Oh, the beloved quiz. Pause the recording. Let's resume here real quick. By now, we should be able to define the different types of users or user access, describe Ntfs in a little bit more detail than what we talked about earlier, and how it intends to address security threats. Also, compare and contrast some of the Ntfs directory and file permissions. Hopefully we got screenshots of that, and understand the difference, in security or access that is granted with regards to copying versus moving a folder. And then be able to describe single sign-on and Bitlocker and EFS. Any questions, comments, concerns, complaints? No? All right. Well, I will have that one up